April 12, 1945. 3:47 p.m. Buchenwald concentration camp, Germany. General George S. Patton walked through the gates and stopped. His aide, watching from a few steps behind, had never seen the general freeze like that. Patton had commanded armies through North Africa, Sicily, and France. He had seen cities bombed to rubble and battlefields stacked with bodies. He thought he knew what war looked like. Then he saw Buchenwald. For several long seconds, Patton stood completely still. His face, normally animated and expressive, went blank. Then he walked forward into the camp, and what he saw in the next 30 minutes would shake him in a way that 2 years of combat never had. This is the story of what happened when one of America's toughest generals came face to face with evidence of the Holocaust. If you want more deep dives into the real stories of World War II, the moments that don't make it into textbooks, hit subscribe. We're building something special here. What Patton saw at Buchenwald changed how he thought about the war, about the enemy, and about what American soldiers were really fighting for. It also led to one of his most controversial decisions, an order that nearly got him relieved of command just weeks before Germany surrendered. To understand why Buchenwald hit Patton so hard, you need to understand who Patton was in April 1945. He was 59 years old and at the peak of his career. His Third Army had just executed the fastest advance in military history, racing across France and into Germany. His soldiers loved him because he led from the front and won battles. His fellow generals tolerated him because Eisenhower protected him. The press called him Old Blood and Guts, though his soldiers had a different version of that nickname that can't be repeated here. But Patton had a blind spot. He thought war was about armies fighting armies. He had studied military history obsessively since childhood and believed in something he called the warrior code. Soldiers fought soldiers. Civilians were off limits. Even the enemy deserved respect if they fought bravely. This wasn't naive idealism. It was how Patton understood the world. He had even expressed admiration for Rommel's tactical skill and said German soldiers fought well. That view was about to be destroyed. By early April 1945, Patton's Third Army was driving deep into central Germany. The Wehrmacht was collapsing. German units were surrendering by the thousands. Patton's biggest problem wasn't fighting the Germans anymore. It was figuring out what to do with all the prisoners his army was capturing. Then, on April 11th, soldiers from the 6th Armored Division reported something strange. They had overrun a large camp near the city of Weimar. The camp was called Buchenwald. The initial reports were confusing. Officers radioed that they had found thousands of prisoners, but these weren't German soldiers or even captured Allied troops. They were civilians, barely alive, dressed in striped rags. Patton's intelligence officers tried to make sense of the reports. They knew the Germans ran prison camps, but this sounded different. By the evening of April 11th, more details arrived. The camp held political prisoners, Jews, and others the Nazis considered enemies. Conditions were reportedly horrific, but the reports were second-hand, filtered through radio communications from units still fighting their way forward. Eisenhower, who was supreme commander, decided this needed to be seen firsthand. He ordered Patton and Omar Bradley, commander of 12th Army Group, to visit Buchenwald the next day. Eisenhower himself would come the day after. This wasn't optional. Eisenhower wanted his generals to witness what American forces had liberated. Patton didn't want to go. He told his chief of staff the visit was a waste of time. His army was advancing 30 miles a day. The war would be over in weeks. He had battles to fight and logistics to manage. But Eisenhower's order was clear, so on April 12th, Patton and Bradley drove to Buchenwald. They arrived in mid-afternoon. The camp commandant had fled 3 days earlier when he heard American tanks approaching. Prisoners had taken control of the camp and were waiting when Patton's jeep pulled up to the gates. What hit Patton first was the smell. It reached them before they entered the camp. Patton later wrote that it was unlike anything he had encountered, and he had been on battlefields where bodies had been rotting for days. This was different. It was the smell of death mixed with disease and human waste. Then they walked inside. The prisoners were skeletal. That's the word everyone used later, but it doesn't capture what it actually looked like. These were people who weighed 70 or 80 pounds. Their bones showed through their skin. Many couldn't stand. They sat or lay on the ground, too weak to move. Some reached out toward the American generals. Others just stared. Bradley walked through the camp taking notes. He had been a schoolteacher before becoming a soldier, and his instinct was to observe and document. Patton's reaction was visceral. His aide watched him turn pale. Patton stopped at one barracks and looked inside at the wooden bunks stacked 3 high where prisoners slept. The aide said Patton's breathing changed, becoming shallow and quick. Then they were shown the crematorium, the ovens where bodies were burned. There were still bodies stacked outside waiting to be destroyed. Camp survivors explained through interpreters that the Germans had been trying to destroy evidence before the Americans arrived. Patton walked outside and vomited. For a man who prided himself on toughness, who had built his entire career on being harder and more aggressive than everyone else, this was humiliating. But he couldn't control it. He leaned against a building and was sick again. Bradley, watching this, later wrote that he had never seen Patton lose his composure. After Patton recovered, he did something that surprised Bradley. He ordered military photographers to document everything. Every barracks, every body, every oven. He wanted pictures of the survivors. He wanted pictures of the guards who had been captured. He wanted evidence that no one could deny. Then Patton made the decision that would cause controversy. He ordered soldiers from his Third Army to round up German civilians from Weimar, the nearby city, and march them through the camp. He wanted them to see it. He wanted them to face what had been done in their country, practically in their backyard. The order created immediate problems. Weimar's residents claimed they didn't know about Buchenwald. The camp had been there since 1937, just 5 miles from the city, but they insisted they had no idea what happened inside. Patton didn't believe them and didn't care if they were telling the truth. He ordered 1,000 civilians to march through the camp. Eisenhower's staff questioned whether this was appropriate. The rules of occupation were still being worked out, and forcing civilians to view atrocities might violate protocols. Some officers worried it could incite resistance or create sympathy for the Germans. Patton's response, according to witnesses, was brief and profane. He said something to the effect that anyone who lived near the camp and claimed ignorance was either a liar or a fool, and either way they needed to see what had been done. On April 16th, German civilians walked through Buchenwald. American soldiers lined the route and made sure everyone looked. Some civilians cried. Some claimed shock. A few fainted. Many tried to look away, and soldiers ordered them to keep their eyes open. Patton watched from a distance. The policy spread. Other commanders started doing the same thing at camps their units liberated. Eisenhower, after visiting Buchenwald himself on April 13th, supported the approach. He invited members of Congress and journalists to tour the camps. He wanted the world to see what had been found. But Patton's view of the war had fundamentally changed. Before Buchenwald, he had seen the Germans as a worthy opponent. Afterward, he saw them differently. His diary entries from mid-April show confusion and anger. He had believed war had rules, that even enemies shared certain values. Buchenwald proved that belief wrong. The experience also changed how Patton thought about his own soldiers. He had pushed them hard, sometimes brutally, to advance faster and fight harder. After Buchenwald, he told his staff that his soldiers had been fighting for something more important than he realized. They hadn't just been winning battles. They had been stopping something evil. The controversy over forcing civilians to view the camps continued for weeks. Some argued it was collective punishment, making innocent people responsible for Nazi crimes. Others said it was necessary, that Germans needed to confront what had been done in their name. Patton never wavered. He believed every German who claimed ignorance was complicit. Eisenhower's decision to document everything and bring witnesses proved strategically brilliant. When the war ended weeks later, some people immediately began questioning whether reports about the camps were exaggerated. The photographs, the testimonies, the physical evidence all became crucial. Patton's insistence on thorough documentation helped create a historical record that couldn't be denied. But there was a deeper impact on Patton personally. He had built his identity around being a warrior, someone who understood combat at a level others didn't. Buchenwald showed him something combat couldn't explain. This wasn't war. This was systematic murder on an industrial scale. His warrior code, his belief in honorable combat between soldiers, meant nothing in the face of what he had seen. In the days after visiting Buchenwald, Patton's behavior changed in subtle ways that his staff noticed. He was less jovial, less likely to make the crude jokes he was famous for. He spent more time alone in his quarters. His diary from this period, normally filled with commentary on tactics and complaints about other generals, contains long passages trying to process what he had witnessed. Patton never publicly spoke in detail about his reaction at Buchenwald. He didn't give interviews about vomiting or losing his composure. His official reports were factual and brief, but his actions spoke clearly. The man who had complained about visiting the camp became one of its most vocal advocates for documentation and accountability. The question that haunted military historians later was whether seeing Buchenwald changed Patton's approach to the final weeks of the war. Some argue that his already aggressive style became even more ruthless. His Third Army took fewer prisoners in late April than they had in March, though this could also be explained by increasing German desperation as the war ended. What's certain is that Patton never again expressed admiration for German military skill. Before Buchenwald, he had occasionally praised enemy tactics or shown respect for German commanders. After Buchenwald, that stopped completely. In his mind, the German army was now inseparable from the camps, from the evidence of what Germany had done. So when Patton walked through the gates of Buchenwald on April 12, 1945, and stood frozen for those few seconds before going inside, he was standing at a threshold in more ways than one. He was about to see something that would break his understanding of war and force him to confront evil in a form he had never imagined. His reaction, losing control and being physically sick, revealed something important about Patton that gets lost in the myths. He wasn't actually as hard as his reputation suggested. He had created a persona, a character he played, because he believed soldiers needed commanders who appeared unbreakable. But Buchenwald broke through that armor and revealed the man underneath. The camps liberated in April and May 1945 forced all the Allied commanders to grapple with questions they hadn't anticipated. Eisenhower, Bradley, and Patton had planned for defeating the German army. They hadn't planned for what they would find when they won. The camps changed the meaning of victory, turning it from a military achievement into a moral imperative. Buchenwald remained operational as a Soviet camp for several years after the war, an irony Patton would have noted bitterly if he had lived to see it. He died in December 1945, 7 months after visiting the camp, from injuries in a car accident. His last diary entries, written in the hospital, made no mention of Buchenwald. But people who visited him in those final days said the camp came up in conversation. He told one visitor that seeing Buchenwald had justified everything his soldiers had endured. Thanks for watching this deep dive into a moment that doesn't usually make it into Patton biographies. If you want more stories about the real World War II, the decisions and moments that shaped the war, subscribe to the channel. These stories deserve to be told.